Her sewing box didn't lock. It never had to. For 41 years it sat on the shelf in our bedroom closet, and not once did I think to open it while she was alive. Because a man doesn't go digging through his wife's private things just because he's curious. I opened it 3 days after her funeral, and what I found inside it was the reason my own son had a locksmith standing on my porch by 9 o'clock the next morning. You had your turn in this house, Dad. It's time you let it go to someone who actually needs it. That's what Marcus said to me, standing in the driveway, with his hands in his coat pockets, while the man from Anderson Lock and Key knelt at my own front door, with a drill in his hand. The wind had picked up. Somewhere down the block a dog was barking at nothing, the way dogs do, and it kept barking through the silence that followed, because nobody else made a sound. Not the locksmith. Not Kimberly, standing by the car with her arms crossed and her sunglasses on despite the gray sky. Not me. I just stood there on my own front walk, in the suit I'd worn to bury my wife 2 days earlier, and listened to my son tell me I'd had my turn. A house is not a turn. A turn is something you take on a swing set, something you hand off when the whistle blows. A house is 41 years of a woman's hands in the kitchen, and a man's back bent over a lawnmower on Saturday mornings, and a porch step you fix twice because the first time you did it wrong. You do not have a turn at a life. But I didn't say any of that to Marcus, because in that moment I had gone somewhere very quiet inside myself, the way I used to go quiet at the county recorder's office, when a deed came across my desk that didn't add up. Something in the numbers wrong. Something in the chain of title broken. You don't shout when you find that. You go still, and you start reading everything again, slower this time. My name is Walter Ashford. I am 63 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a title examiner for Cedar County, Ohio, which means I spent 3 decades of my life reading other people's deeds. I read the fine print nobody else wanted to read. I traced ownership back through 5, 6, 7 generations of families, following a piece of land from a farmer in 1911, through a divorce in 1958, through a bank foreclosure in 1982, until I could tell you with absolute certainty who owned what and why. People used to joke that I could find a mistake in a marriage certificate. My wife Eleanor used to say I read cereal boxes like they might be hiding a lien somewhere. She wasn't entirely wrong. I tell you this now, at the start, so you understand something important. I am not a man who acts on feeling. I am a man who acts on what the paper says, and 3 days after I buried the only woman I ever loved, the paper started telling me something my own son didn't know. I knew, let me back up, because you should understand what was lost before I tell you what was found. Eleanor and I met in the fall of 1985 at a Grange Hall dance in Millbrook, the kind of small Ohio town where everybody's grandfather knew everybody else's grandfather, and where the biggest scandal in a given year was usually somebody's cattle getting loose on Route 9. She was 24, working as a nurse at the county hospital, and she had a laugh that came out sideways, like it surprised even her. I was 26 3 years into the job at the recorder's office, and I did not know how to dance, which she found endlessly, mercilessly funny for the better part of 40 years. We bought the house on Larkspur Lane in the spring of 1987. 3 bedrooms, a crooked oak tree in the backyard that dropped acorns on the roof every October like clockwork. A kitchen with linoleum so ugly. Eleanor said it built character. We didn't have money for furniture. We had a card table and 2 folding chairs for the first 8 months. And Eleanor used to set a candle on that card table on Friday nights and tell me we were dining at the finest restaurant in Millbrook. I believed her. I still believe her. Marcus was born in 1982, before the house, back when we were renting a 2-room apartment above a hardware store. By the time we moved to Larkspur Lane, he was 5 years old and already the kind of boy who charmed his way out of trouble before you'd even finished explaining what the trouble was. He grew into a man who could sell anything to anyone. And he did, eventually going into commercial real estate, which I always found a little bit funny, given my own line of work. Father spends his life making sure land changes hands honestly. Son spends his life making sure it changes hands quickly. We used to joke about that too, before things went the way they went. I want to be honest with you about something, because a man telling his own story owes you that much. I was not a perfect father. When Marcus was 14, in the spring after his grandmother, my mother, passed away, I went quiet for the better part of a year. Not cruel, not absent in any way you could point to. I still made his lunches, still went to his baseball games, still sat at the dinner table every night. But I wasn't there, not really, and Marcus has told me since, more than once, that it was the year he learned not to bring me his problems, because I never seemed to have room for them alongside my own. I think about that more than I let on. I think a man plants things in his children without meaning to, and sometimes what he plants doesn't bear fruit for 30 years, and by the time it does, he's forgotten he ever put the seed in the ground at all. Kimberly came into the family 12 years ago. She works in home staging, the kind of business where you rent furniture and hang the right paintings and convince a buyer that a house they've never lived in already feels like a memory. She is good at her job. She is, I have come to understand, very good at her job in ways that extend considerably beyond furniture. Eleanor's heart had been giving her trouble for 2 years before she died. Not dramatic trouble. The kind of trouble that comes with a pamphlet from the cardiologist and a pill organizer with 7 little compartments and a slow, careful adjustment to a life with fewer stairs in it. We managed it. We managed it together, the way we'd managed everything for 39 years, and I genuinely believed we had more time. I believed it the morning she went out to the garden to check on her tomato plants and didn't come back in, and I found her sitting against the fence in the September sun, looking for all the world like she'd just decided to rest a moment, except that she never got back up. I will not walk you through the funeral in detail. Some things a man keeps for himself. I will tell you that Marcus gave a eulogy that made the whole church cry, that he spoke about his mother's laugh and her stubborn tomato plants, and the way she used to slip $5 bills into his coat pocket even after he was 44 years old and made more money than I ever had. I will tell you that watching my son cry at his mother's casket was the last moment, for a long while, that I recognized him completely. 2 days later, he was standing in my driveway telling me I'd had my turn. Here is what happened in between, because the 2 days matter. The day after the funeral, Marcus and Kimberly came by the house with a casserole dish, the way people do, and Kimberly walked through the downstairs rooms, slower than seemed natural, running her hand along the door frames, standing in the kitchen a beat too long looking at the cabinets. I noticed it. I notice things, it is. God help me. The only skill I have ever had. But I told myself she was grieving too, in her own way, taking in the home her mother-in-law had built. Grief does strange things to attention. I let it go. That evening, after they left, I went looking for the good scissors in the hall closet and found, instead, a stack of folded moving blankets I didn't recognize, still creased from the store, sitting on the shelf above the coats. I remember standing there a moment, scissors forgotten, looking at those blankets the way I used to look at a deed with a date that didn't line up. Something in me went still. But it had been one day since I'd buried my wife, and a man's mind reaches for the ordinary explanation before it reaches for the terrible one, because the ordinary explanation lets him keep breathing. The next morning, the locksmith was on my porch. I want to tell you exactly what Marcus said, because I've turned it over in my mind every night since, the way you turn a stone over looking for the crack that will finally split it in half. Dad, listen, Mom's gone, and I know what that is for you. But we have to be practical. This house is 4 bedrooms for 1 person. Kimberly and I have been looking at senior communities out on Route 9, real nice ones, and there's a 2-bedroom unit opening up next month. You'd have people to eat lunch with. You wouldn't be rattling around this place alone. You're changing my locks, Marcus. We're changing the locks because Mom's estate needs to be secured properly until everything's settled. That's just good practice. You know that better than anyone. You did this for a living. He said it with a small, apologetic smile, like he was quoting my own rulebook back to me, using 31 years of my professional life as the hinge to swing the door shut on me. This is my house, I said, not your mother's estate. Mine. Ours. It always has been. And that's when Marcus said the thing I will hear for the rest of my life, in his voice, in that driveway, with the locksmith's drill whining behind him like some small mechanical animal that had learned to laugh. You had your turn in this house, Dad. It's time you let it go to someone who actually needs it. Kimberly didn't say a word. She stood by the car in her sunglasses with her arms crossed, and I understood, even then, even in the sharpest part of my grief, that she was not simply present for this, she was supervising it. I did not argue. I want you to understand why, because it will matter later. I did not argue because arguing on a driveway with a locksmith drilling into my front door was not going to win me anything except a worse version of the same fight an hour from now. I have read enough legal disputes in my career to know that the man who keeps his composure on day 1 is the man whose testimony matters on day 60. So I said, "All right, Marcus," and I let them think they'd won something, and I drove myself to the Cedar Inn on Route 9 for the night, with a bag I packed in 11 minutes, and I did not cry until I was alone in that motel room with the television playing something I never watched. But before I left, and this is the part I need you to sit with, I went back into the house one more time, while the locksmith was still working on the front door and Marcus was on his phone in the driveway, and I went up to our bedroom, to the closet, to the shelf where Eleanor's sewing box had sat, untouched by me for 41 years. I don't know what made me open it that day of all days. I have thought about this more than anything else in this whole ordeal. Why that hour? Why that box? Why, after 4 decades of respecting a woman's private things, I finally lifted that lid? I think, if I am honest, some part of me already knew that everything I understood about my own life was about to be rearranged, and some older, quieter part of me reached for the one place in this house that had always belonged entirely to her, as if her hands might still be able to steady mine. Inside, beneath the spools of thread and the pincushion shaped like a tomato that Marcus made her in 3rd grade, there was a manila envelope, soft with age, the kind of soft that comes from being handled many times over many years. My name was written on the front in her handwriting, not Walter, just for my husband when he needs it most and not before. I did not open it there. The locksmith called out that he was finishing up, and Marcus's voice carried up the stairwell, asking if I needed help carrying anything down, and something in me, the same something that used to catch a forged signature before the rest of the page had even registered, told me not to let anyone see what I was holding. I put the envelope inside my jacket, against my chest. The way you'd carry something that might still be beating, I carried it to the Cedar Inn that night. I set it on the nightstand, and I looked at it for 3 hours before I found the courage to open it, because some part of me understood. The way you understand a storm is coming from the particular color the sky turns, that whatever was inside that envelope was going to change the shape of everything that came after. When I finally broke the seal, the first thing that fell out was not a letter. It was a deed, not the deed to 414 Larkspur Lane, not the one Marcus had grown up believing would someday be his. The one whose copy sat in our fire safe downstairs where he'd seen it 100 times over the years. This was a second deed, recorded 11 years earlier for a different parcel entirely, one I had not thought about in a very long time, because I had spent 11 years believing it no longer mattered. I sat on the edge of that motel bed with my wife's handwriting in one hand, and a stranger's understanding of my own life opening up in front of me, and for the first time since I'd stood in the driveway and heard my son tell me I'd had my turn, I felt something other than grief. I felt the particular cold clarity of a man who has just found the one line in 100 pages of paperwork that changes what every other line means. Eleanor's letter began with 4 words that I have read so many times now that I could recite them in my sleep, and that I will carry with me, I suspect, for whatever years I have left. Walter, they don't know. The letter was 4 pages long, written in the careful cursive Eleanor used for grocery lists and Christmas cards, the same handwriting I'd been reading for 40 years without ever once suspecting it was building toward this. Walter, they don't know. And I need you to hear the rest of this before you decide what to do about it, because I know you, and I know the first thing your mind will do is start looking for someone to blame. Do you remember? 11 years ago, the spring, Marcus came to us asking for $80,000. He called it a bridge loan. He said it was for a commercial property near the interstate, a strip of retail space he and two partners were putting together. And he said it so smoothly, Walter, so much like you'd expect from a boy who spent his whole career selling confidence to strangers, that I almost didn't notice what was underneath it. But I did notice. A mother notices. He wasn't asking us for help. He was asking us to trust a plan he wouldn't fully explain, the same way he used to ask to borrow the car at 17, without telling us where he was actually going. We gave him 30,000, not 80. You remember that part? You were the one who talked him down, gently the way you talk everyone down, with numbers instead of feelings. I never told you what happened after. He came back to me alone, 2 weeks later, and asked for the rest without telling you. He said you'd already said no once, and he didn't want to put you through it again. He asked me to keep it between us. And Walter, I did. God forgive me, I did. Because he is my son, and I did not yet understand what I was protecting him from becoming. I stopped reading there. I had to. I sat on the edge of that motel bed with the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Not dramatically. Just a fine tremor. The kind you get when your body is trying to process something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. And I thought about my son at 33 years old, sitting across from his mother at our kitchen table, asking her to keep a secret from me. I thought about all the years since, all the Thanksgivings and Christmases and ordinary Tuesday phone calls, and I wondered how many other rooms in my own son's life I had never been let into. I want to tell you something about myself here, because I promised you honesty, and I intend to keep that promise even where it doesn't flatter me. When Eleanor's letter told me she'd kept that secret from me for 11 years, my first feeling was not sympathy for her position. It was something colder and smaller, something that had been sitting in me since Marcus was 14, and I went quiet for a year after my mother died. My first thought was, I did this. Whatever he became, some piece of the soil he grew out of, I planted. I am not proud of how long it took me to move past that thought and back to the letter, but I want you to know it was there, because a man who tells you his family fell apart entirely because of someone else's cruelty is usually leaving something out. I kept reading. After that spring, I started paying closer attention. Walter, the way you taught me to without ever meaning to teach me. I watched the way Marcus talked about money, never what he had, always what was coming, always some deal 3 weeks from closing that would finally put things right. I watched Kimberly too, in those years before you really got to know her, and I noticed that she was the one who did the talking whenever numbers came up, and Marcus mostly nodded. I am not telling you this to turn you against your son, or against her. I am telling you because it's why I did what I did next, and I need you to understand that it came from love, not from anger. You remember my Aunt Ruth passed that same year, and left me $41,000, enough, with what we'd saved, to finally pay off the house, free and clear. You wanted to do it the simple way, refinance and be done with it. I asked you to let me handle the paperwork instead, and you did, Walter. Because you have always trusted me with the parts of our life you didn't think mattered enough to double-check. That was the year I went to see Thomas Reyes on my own, on a Tuesday, while you were at a title conference in Columbus. I told him what I'd noticed about our son. I told him I didn't want to punish Marcus. I wanted to protect the house, not from a stranger, but from a bridge loan that might someday become a mortgage. Might someday become a house. Marcus had quietly leveraged to cover a deal that went bad, without either of us ever knowing until the bank called. Thomas drew up a document neither of us ever mentioned to you directly, though I always meant to, and I am sorry, truly sorry, that I let so many years pass without finding the courage. We placed the house into an irrevocable trust. You and I remain the life tenants. Nothing changes for us. Nothing has ever changed for us. We live here exactly as we always have until both of us are gone. But the deed that transfers on our passing is not the deed Marcus has seen sitting in our fire safe all these years. That deed is decorative now, Walter, a keepsake, nothing more. The real deed, the second deed, is the one Thomas recorded quietly at the county courthouse in March of 2013, naming our future grandchildren as the ultimate beneficiaries, held by an independent trustee until each of them turns 25. Marcus receives nothing from this house, not because I stopped loving him, because I loved him enough to stop him from ever being able to gamble away the one thing in this family that was never supposed to be for sale. I set the letter down on the bed, and I sat there for a long time in the fluorescent hum of that motel room, not moving, the way I used to sit at my desk at the recorder's office after finding a discrepancy so old and so buried that I had to read it 3 times before I trusted my own eyes. 11 years. My wife had carried this alone for 11 years, protecting a decision that would someday break our son's heart because she loved him too much to let him break himself first. I did not know it yet, but that letter was only the first of 3 things Eleanor had left behind for me to find, and the second one was going to be considerably harder to read. I did not sleep that night. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up trying and drove to the all-night diner on Route 9, the one Eleanor and I used to stop at after her early hospital shifts, back when we were young enough that 4 in the morning didn't feel like an insult to your whole body. I sat in our usual booth, and the waitress, a woman named Donna, who has worked that counter for as long as I've been driving this road, came over with a coffee pot and started to say, out of 40 years of habit, the usual for 2, hon? I could not answer her. I opened my mouth and nothing came, and my hand, without my telling it to, reached across the table to the empty side of the booth, where Eleanor's coffee cup should have been, patting the space the way you'd pat a pocket to check for your keys. Some reflex older than my grief that hadn't caught up yet to the fact that there was nothing there to find. Donna understood before I did. She set the coffee pot down, came around the booth, and put her hand on my shoulder without a word, and I sat there in a diner booth at 4 in the morning, with a stranger's hand on my shoulder, because I could not, for the life of me, tell my own body that the other cup was never coming back. That is the part of this story I am least proud to tell you, and the part I suspect you will understand best. I drove home, to a house I could no longer enter, around 6, and sat in my car across the street until I saw Lou Dietrich's kitchen light come on next door. Lou has lived across from us for 19 years. He retired from the county road crew and spends his mornings on his porch with a thermos and a habit of noticing everything that happens on Larkspur Lane, which most people find nosy and I have always found comforting. Walter. He came down his steps in his robe when he saw me get out of the car. You look like hell, if you don't mind my saying. I don't mind. They really changed the locks on you? I told him they had. Lou's jaw did something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of tightening that made him look 10 years younger, and considerably more dangerous. I got a camera on the porch, he said. Has for 3 years, since the Hendersons' place got broken into. Points right at your driveway. You want to see something? That was the second piece of evidence I found that week. And I found it the way I found nearly everything in this whole ordeal. Not by breaking a single rule I'd spent 31 years enforcing, but by asking the people who had legally, rightfully, already seen what I needed to see. Lou's footage went back 4 days. It showed Marcus's truck arriving at the house 11 days before Eleanor died. 11 days, while she was still alive, still sitting in her garden, with moving blankets in the truck bed, the same blankets I'd found folded in the hall closet. It showed Kimberly walking the perimeter of the yard with a woman I didn't recognize, both of them stopping at points along the fence line. The second woman occasionally raising a phone to take photographs. It showed on a separate morning a man in a gray blazer standing in our driveway with a clipboard, walking the length of the house, crouching at the foundation the way you'd inspect something you were about to buy. You know who that is? Lou asked, tapping the screen. I did not then. But 2 days later, at the county recorder's office, my old colleague Sal Petrenko would tell me exactly who he was, and that conversation would be the third thing that broke my understanding of my own family clean in half. Sal Petrenko and I worked side by side for 26 years. He's retired now too, technically, but he still comes in 3 days a week as a part-time consultant the way men like us do because we don't entirely know how to stop. When I called him and asked if he could pull the recorded history on 414 Larkspur Lane, he didn't ask why. He just said, "Give me 20 minutes," which is the particular kindness of a man who has spent his career understanding that some requests don't need a reason attached, What Sal found, sitting across from me in the break room where I'd eaten 1,000 lunches over 3 decades, confirmed everything in Eleanor's letter and added one detail she hadn't known, or hadn't lived long enough to learn. "There's a UCC filing here," Sal said, sliding a printout across the table, "from about 7 weeks ago. Somebody ran a title search on this property. Not through the county's public terminal, through a private title company, the kind real estate investors use when they're doing due diligence before making an offer." He looked up at me over his glasses, the same look he used to give me when a file didn't add up. "Walter, somebody's been shopping your house." The requesting party listed on the search was a real estate acquisitions firm I'd never heard of, based 40 minutes away in Dayton. But the name of the individual agent who'd submitted the request, the man Lou's camera had caught standing in my driveway with a clipboard, was Derek Voss. I did not know the name Derek Voss, but I would learn within the week that Kimberly did, considerably better than her husband did, and that the second deed in this story was not the only thing that had been kept secret inside my family. I did not know it yet. But the man walking my property with a clipboard wasn't working for Marcus at all. Sophie is 8 years old, and she is the only person in this entire ordeal who told me the truth without being asked to. I saw her 3 days after I found Eleanor's letter, at the small park 2 blocks from what used to be my house, because Kimberly still let me see my granddaughter, at least in those early days, before things got as sharp as they eventually got. Sophie was on the swings, working her legs the determined way children do when they're trying to go higher than physics wants to let them, and when she saw me, she jumped off mid-arc, the way that used to stop my heart when Marcus did it 40 years ago, and ran over and wrapped both arms around my waist without a word. I stood there in that park holding my granddaughter, and something in my chest that had been locked as tight as my own front door finally quietly came loose. It was the first time since Eleanor died that I let myself cry where someone could see me. "Grandpa," she said. Once she'd pulled back and looked up at me with Eleanor's exact same sideways way of narrowing her eyes when she was working something out. "Why does Mommy keep calling the man about the house money instead of about Grandma?" I crouched down slowly. The way my knees have started reminding me is no longer as easy as it used to be. "What man, sweetheart?" "The one from her work. Derek. He calls a lot. Mommy goes in the other room and I'm not supposed to listen. But I heard her say Grandma's house one time and I got confused because I thought this was your house, not a house she works on. I have interviewed exactly no one in my life for a living, but I have read 10,000 pages of legal documents, and I know the sound of a true, unrehearsed sentence when I hear one. My 8-year-old granddaughter, without meaning to, without any understanding of what she was handing me, had just told me more in 11 words than a week of legal filings had managed to explain. Kimberly wasn't simply helping Marcus manage his mother's estate. Kimberly was working the house, my house, with a man named Derek Voss, on the phone, in a room she didn't want her own daughter to hear. "Sophie," I said, keeping my voice as steady and as gentle as I could manage, while something inside my chest rearranged itself entirely. "You did nothing wrong telling me that. You understand?" "Nothing wrong at all." She nodded, satisfied, the particular satisfaction of a child who has just been believed, and ran back to the swings. And I stood in that park, with my granddaughter's voice still hanging in the cold afternoon air, and I understood that I was no longer looking at a son who wanted to move his grieving father into a senior community for practical reasons. I was looking at the opening moves of a sale. The offices of Reyes and Wallace sit above a dry cleaner on Main Street, in the same 3-room suite Thomas Reyes has occupied for as long as I can remember him practicing law in this county. He is 71 now, a small, precise man who still wears a tie every day of his life, including, I suspect, the day he eventually retires for good. And when his receptionist showed me back to his office, he stood up from behind a desk cluttered with files, the way lawyers' desks are always cluttered, and he did not shake my hand. He came around the desk and put both arms around me instead, which surprised me, because in 20 years of knowing Thomas Reyes as our family's attorney, he had never once hugged me. "I heard about Eleanor," he said, his voice rougher than I'd ever heard it. "I should have called. I've been a coward about it, Walter, and I'm sorry. I want to tell you something about that embrace because it matters more than it might seem to from the outside. Thomas Reyes and I are not men who touch each other in greeting. We are men who shake hands, who nod, who say good to see you and mean it and keep 3 feet of distance while we say it. That is simply how men of our generation, in a town like Millbrook, learn to carry affection, sideways, through handshakes and favors and showing up. But he held on to me in that office a moment longer than either of us expected, and I found myself gripping the back of his jacket, the way I hadn't let myself grip anything since the funeral, and something loosened in my chest that had been wound tight since I stood in my own driveway and watched a locksmith drill into my front door. I did not know, until that moment, how much I had needed one person in this entire ordeal to simply hold on to me without asking me to explain myself first. "Sit down," he said, once we'd both recovered ourselves enough to pretend we hadn't needed that. "I have a feeling you're not here about the will." I set Eleanor's letter and the second deed on his desk. I watched him read both, slowly, the particular slowness of a man rereading his own handiwork from over a decade earlier. And when he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "She came to me alone in February of 2013, he said. "I want you to know I pushed her, Walter. I told her more than once that you deserved to be part of that conversation. She told me she'd tell you herself, in her own time, and I let that be enough. Because it wasn't my marriage to protect, and it wasn't my place to override her judgment about her own son." He tapped the deed. "This is airtight. I drafted it myself, recorded it myself, and I've reviewed the trust language at least twice a year every year since, the way I do with every irrevocable instrument in my practice. Marcus has no claim to 414 Larkspur Lane. He never did, not since March of 2013. The deed sitting in your fire safe is, legally speaking, decorations. He doesn't know, no." Thomas folded his hands. "And Walter, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Because how you answer changes what I recommend next. Do you want to protect this trust, or do you want to punish your son?" It was, I think, the most important question anyone asked me in the whole of this ordeal, and I did not answer it quickly. I sat in that office with the traffic noise from Main Street, drifting up through the old window frame, and I thought about Marcus at 5 years old on Larkspur Lane, and Marcus at 14 going quiet in the year I went quiet, and Marcus at 44 crying at his mother's casket, and Marcus standing in my driveway telling me I'd had my turn. "I want the truth to be the thing that stops him," I said finally. "Not me, not a courtroom if I can help it, the truth." Thomas nodded slowly, like that was the answer he'd been hoping for. "Then here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. This deed protects the house. It doesn't, on its own, explain the moving blankets, or the man with the clipboard, or the private title search. Somebody has been trying to move this property, Walter, and whoever it is doesn't know about this trust yet. Because if they did, they wouldn't have wasted 7 weeks and real money on a title search that's going to come back telling them the house isn't Marcus's to sell." He looked at me carefully. "That tells me one important thing. This didn't start with the trust. This started with a debt, and somebody decided the house was the fastest way to pay it off. That afternoon, at Thomas's suggestion, I did something I had never once done in 31 years of respecting a family's privacy. I went home, to the house I could no longer legally enter, and I sat in my car in my own driveway, because Ohio law is clear that a spouse listed as a legal owner cannot be criminally barred from the curtilage of a jointly occupied residence, regardless of a lock change, a fact Thomas had confirmed for me before I left his office, along with a stern instruction not to attempt entry, only to observe. I did not have to wait long. At 4:40 that afternoon, a car I didn't recognize, a silver sedan with Dayton dealer plates, pulled into my driveway, and the man who got out of it was the same man from Lou's porch camera, gray blazer, clipboard, tucked now under one arm, instead of held out in front of him. Kimberly came out the front door to meet him before he'd even reached the porch steps, and I watched, from a legal distance, through a windshield, doing nothing more than any neighbor idly parked on a public street might do. As she reached up and adjusted his collar with both hands, a gesture so unmistakably, achingly intimate that I felt it land in my chest like a physical blow. I did not confront her that day. I want you to understand why, because a man in my position, watching that gesture, feels every instinct in his body telling him to get out of the car. But I had spent 31 years learning that the man who moves first, before he has the full picture, is the man who loses the case. I drove back to the Cedar Inn, and I called Thomas, and I told him what I'd seen. And he told me something that turned out to matter more than either of us understood at the time. Walter, I want you to think back. When did the moving blankets first show up in your hall closet? The day after the funeral. But Marcus said the locksmith visit was about securing the estate. And when did the title search happen? 7 weeks before that, Sal said. So somebody was planning to move on this property while Eleanor was still alive. Thomas's voice had gone very careful, very measured, the voice of a man laying out facts he doesn't want to say plainly yet. That's not a grieving family making a hasty decision after a loss, Walter. That's a plan that predates the loss. I don't like what that suggests, and I don't think you do either. I didn't sleep well that night. Turning that sentence over and over, a plan that predates the loss. Until somewhere around 2 in the morning, I finally understood what had been sitting at the edge of my mind since the diner, since Sophie's swing set, since Lou's porch camera. I picked up the motel phone and called my own house, the old landline, the one Eleanor and I had kept for 30 years out of stubbornness more than necessity. The one number in this whole family nobody had thought to change because nobody imagined a locked-out old man would ever think to dial it. Nobody answered. But the answering machine picked up. Eleanor's voice, recorded years ago, cheerful and steady, telling callers we couldn't come to the phone right now, and I sat on the edge of that motel bed and listened to my dead wife's voice for the first time since the funeral, and I nearly hung up rather than bear it. I didn't. And after the beep, before I could speak, I heard that the machine was already playing back a message that had apparently been left and never cleared. The sound cutting in mid-sentence, a man's voice, low, urgent, clearly not intended for me at all. Already told you, Kim. We close this by the 15th or the whole thing falls apart on my end. Derek's got 2 other buyers circling, and if this deal doesn't clear my books by end of quarter, I'm the one who's exposed here, not you. You said Marcus wouldn't ask questions. Make sure he doesn't. I sat frozen on that motel bed with the receiver pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, listening to that message 3 times before I trusted myself to write it down. I did not recognize the voice. But I recognized the shape of what it was telling me, the way I used to recognize the shape of a fraudulent filing before I'd even finished reading the second paragraph. This was not Derek Voss's voice. A second man, someone Kimberly answered to, someone with his own exposure, his own deadline, his own books that needed to clear. Whatever scheme had been built around my house, Kimberly wasn't its architect after all. She was somebody else's instrument, the same way I was beginning to understand that Marcus was hers. I did not know it yet, but the man on that answering machine, a silent partner neither Marcus nor, I would come to learn, even Kimberly fully understood the danger of, was going to be the reason this entire scheme collapsed on itself before I ever had to say a word in public. I went to see Marcus alone 3 days later, without Thomas, without documents, without anything in my hands but the truth I intended to lay in front of him and watch land. I found him at the commercial office he kept downtown, alone at his desk after hours, and when he looked up and saw me standing in his doorway, something crossed his face that I hadn't seen since he was a boy caught in a lie he knew he couldn't talk his way out of, Dad. He stood up too fast, knocking a folder off his desk. You shouldn't be. Sit down, Marcus. He sat. I have never, in 44 years of being his father, seen my son do exactly what I told him to do that fast, without a single word of argument, and some part of me understood in that instant that whatever confidence he'd carried into my driveway a week earlier had already begun cracking under a weight I hadn't yet fully explained to him. I know about the trust, I said. I know Kimberly's been running a title search on the house for 7 weeks. I know about a man named Derek Voss, and I know he's not the only one you owe something to. I know your mother knew before she died more than either of us realized. I set nothing on his desk. I had decided on the drive over that I would not let this conversation become a courtroom. Not yet. Not with him. I want to hear it from you, son. Not from a deed. Not from a camera. From you. Marcus put his face in both hands, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet in a way that had nothing performative in it at all. Nothing like the eulogy. Nothing like the driveway. I owe Kimberly's cousin $210,000, Dad. His voice cracked clean in half on the number. I invested in a development deal with him 3 years ago, and it collapsed, and I never told you. I never told Mom. I kept thinking the next deal would cover it, and then the next one, and Kim kept saying the house was just sitting there, that you two didn't need 4 bedrooms, that it wasn't really about taking anything from you. It was about he stopped. God, listen to me. Listen to what I just said out loud. Say the rest of it, Marcus. I told myself I wasn't stealing from my own father. I told myself I was helping you downsize. He put his head down on his own desk, and the sound that came out of him then was not a sound I had words for, not crying exactly, something lower and older than that. Mom would have. He couldn't finish it. I stood there a long moment, watching my son come apart at his own desk. And I want to tell you honestly that some part of me wanted to let him sit in it, wanted to walk out and let the silence do to him what he'd let a locksmith do to me. But I thought of Eleanor's letter. I did not want to punish Marcus. I wanted to protect the house. And I thought of my own year of silence when he was 14, the seed I'd planted without meaning to. And I crossed the room, and I put my hand on my son's shoulder, and when he turned into it, I held him the way I hadn't held him since he was small enough to carry. I should have told you no, that first time, 30 years ago. Instead of letting your mother carry it alone, I said, into the top of his head, the closest thing to a confession I had made in this whole ordeal. A father's supposed to be the wall his son can't talk his way past. I wasn't always that. Marcus, I own that. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. We stood there in his darkened office a long time, 2 men who had never once in 44 years held on to each other like that. And somewhere in the middle of it I understood that whatever was still coming, Kimberly Voss, the exposed man on the answering machine, the second deed nobody but Thomas and I yet fully understood. My son was not, in the end, going to be standing on the other side of it from me. He was going to be the one who finally told the truth out loud, in front of everyone, at the one gathering none of us could avoid. Eleanor's memorial dinner, 1 month after her funeral, at the Grange Hall where we had met in 1985. The Grange Hall hadn't changed much since 1985. Same scuffed hardwood floor. Eleanor and I had first danced badly across 41 years earlier. Same tall windows letting in the low October light. Same faint smell of coffee and old wood that never quite leaves a building like that no matter how many decades pass through it. The town had turned out for Eleanor's memorial the way small towns do. Nurses she'd worked alongside for 30 years, neighbors, half the congregation from First Methodist. Donna from the diner still in her work apron because she'd come straight from her shift. I stood near the back, in the same suit I'd worn to bury her, and watched the room fill with people who had loved my wife in ways I was only now, a month later, beginning to fully understand. I had not planned to say anything that day. Thomas had advised against it, gently, the way lawyers advise against most things a grieving man wants to do. But I had the envelope in my jacket pocket, the same place I'd carried it since the night at the Cedar Inn, and somewhere in the last hour of that gathering, watching Marcus stand near the coffee table, with his shoulders pulled in tight, and Kimberly a careful 3 feet away from him, checking her phone with a frequency that had nothing to do with grief, I understood that Eleanor herself had left me the way to end this, and that she'd left it in this envelope for a reason I was only now old enough and broken enough to see clearly. I asked Pastor Whitfield if I could say a few words. He looked at me for a long moment. He'd known Eleanor for 2 decades. Known enough about the last month that his eyes carried a kind of careful understanding, and he nodded and stepped aside from the small podium at the front of the hall. The room quieted the way rooms do for a widower. I did not raise my voice. I have never been a man who needed volume to be heard, and grief, I've found, tends to hush a room faster than anger ever could. Most of you knew my wife longer in some ways than I did, I began. Donna knew her Tuesday mornings at 4 a.m. Pastor Whitfield knew the version of her that showed up every Sunday, even the years her knees hurt too much to kneel. I knew her at the kitchen table, mostly, and in the garden, and in the 4 decades of small, ordinary Tuesdays that never once felt small while we were living them. I saw Marcus look up. I saw Kimberly's thumb go still on her phone. "Eleanor left me a letter," I said. I found it 3 days after we buried her, in her sewing box, where she'd kept it for 11 years, waiting for the day I'd need it most. I wasn't going to read any of it here. Some things belong between a husband and his wife, and no one else. I paused, and I looked directly at my son, and something in my chest that had been rehearsing this moment for a month finally steadied itself entirely. But there's one part of it that isn't mine to keep private anymore, because it was never written to me alone. It was written to protect this family, and I think this family deserves to hear it, out loud, together, the way she would have wanted. I want to tell you that my hands didn't shake when I opened that envelope in front of 80 people who had loved my wife. They did. I let them. 11 years ago, I read, "Your father and I made a decision to place the Larkspur Lane house into a trust, protecting it for our grandchildren, because I had come to believe, gently, quietly, without ever wanting to hurt anyone, that our son had built a life on debts he wasn't telling either of us about, and that the house we built together was not safe, sitting in the open the way it had always been. I did not do this because I stopped trusting Marcus to be a good man. I did it because I trusted, more than anything, that he could still become one, given enough time and enough of a wall between his worst decisions and everything his father and I spent 40 years building." The room had gone very still, not the performed stillness of an audience being polite, the real kind, the kind Eleanor's own memorial had somehow been waiting for all afternoon without knowing it. "There's a second page," I said, and I felt my voice catch on it in a way I hadn't expected, written directly to Marcus. She asked me to give it to him only if things ever got difficult enough that he needed to hear it from her instead of from me. I think that day is today. I looked at my son. He had gone the color of old paper, standing near that coffee table, and Kimberly's hand had found his arm, not in comfort, I understood now, but in something closer to restraint. I read the second page anyway, because it was not hers to stop, my darling boy. If you're hearing this, it means something has gone wrong enough that your father decided you needed to hear it from me instead of him, and if that's true, I am so sorry, because it means I am not there to hold your hand through whatever it is. I want you to know something I should have told you 30 years ago, the spring you first came to me asking for money. You didn't want your father to know about. I have never once loved you less for needing help. I have only ever wished you'd let both of us give it to you honestly, instead of teaching yourself, piece by piece, that love in this family had to be managed, negotiated, kept in separate rooms from your father. That was never true, Marcus. It was never once true. Whatever debt brought you to this letter, it is smaller than you think, and it is nothing compared to what your father would do for you if you simply asked him plainly. I am asking you now, from wherever I am, to stop managing him and start trusting him. He is a better wall than you have ever given him credit for being. I did not get to finish reading in silence. Marcus made a sound at the coffee table that broke something loose in the whole room. A sound I recognized because I had heard its beginning in his office 3 weeks earlier, and he crossed the hall in front of everyone, his mother's whole community watching. And he put his arms around me at the podium. In front of 80 people, the second time in a month, my son and I had held each other harder than we had in 40 years combined. "I'm sorry," he said, into my shoulder, loud enough that the front rows heard it. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I let Kim run everything because it was easier than admitting how bad it had gotten. I let a stranger walk our property with a clipboard while Mom was still—" His voice broke entirely. "I was going to let them sell her garden, Dad." Kimberly stood up from her chair so fast it scraped hard against the floor. "Marcus, don't, this isn't the place." And that was when her own sister rose from 2 rows back. Deb Halloran had flown in from Cleveland for the memorial. Quiet the whole afternoon, the kind of relative who sits at the edges of a family gathering and watches more than she speaks. She stood now with both hands flat on the back of the chair in front of her, And her voice, when it came, cut clean across her sister's. "No, Kim, it is the place." Deb's eyes were wet, but her voice didn't waver. "I've watched you talk about this house like a project for 2 years. I told you in July I didn't like the sound of Ray's calls. I told you a man who owes money to people like that doesn't ask nicely twice." She turned, not to Kimberly but to the room, to Marcus, to me. "My sister's cousin Ray Doyle is into some very serious people for money he doesn't have, and he came to Kim 8 months ago asking her to find him a fast sale. Any fast sale, doesn't matter whose. She picked this house because it was the easiest one to reach. I should have said something sooner. I'm saying it now." Kimberly's phone, still in her hand, began ringing at exactly that moment, loud enough to carry. The screen turned enough that half the front row could read the name lighting it up. Ray Doyle. Missed call 4. Nobody in that hall needed a lawyer to explain what they were watching. The whole scheme, the moving blankets, the title search, the man with the clipboard, the sale that had never once been about Marcus's grief or my well-being, collapsed in front of 80 witnesses in the space of about 90 seconds, not because I read them a legal filing, but because the truth had simply gotten too heavy for the people carrying it to hold up any longer. I did not, that day or any day after, stand up and read Kimberly the financial details Thomas had helped me uncover. The debts, the private title search, the exact figures Ray Doyle owed the men he owed them to. Thomas had been clear with me and clear with himself that those numbers belonged in a lawyer's office, and eventually, if it came to that, in front of a county fraud investigator who Thomas had already quietly alerted through the proper channels, not shouted across a memorial dinner in front of a grieving town. What I let the room see was only what Eleanor herself had written, in her own hand, years before any of this began, a letter, verified hers, legally and entirely mine to read aloud. The rest I let collapse under its own weight, the way a bridge collapses not because someone points at it, but because it was never built to hold what it was carrying. Kimberly left the hall without another word, Deb walking out a few paces behind her, not together, not apart either. I never saw her at 14 Larkspur Lane again. Thomas told me, some weeks later, that the title company withdrew its search, that Ray Doyle's arrangement with Derek Voss dissolved somewhere in the tangle of his own creditors closing in, and that whatever legal exposure Kimberly carried in all of it was, at last check, a matter between her and people considerably less patient than a retired title examiner from Millbrook, Ohio. Something I had not expected happened next, and it is the part of this story that I think about more than any deed, any letter, any locked door. People began coming up to me, not to talk about Kimberly, not to gossip about what had just happened. The hall had gone quiet in the particular respectful way small towns manage even at their most stunned, but simply to stand near me. Mrs. Okafor, whose deed I'd helped untangle for free 11 years ago after her husband died and left her a title mess 3 lawyers had quoted her a fortune to fix. Ted Bryson, who I'd spent 4 evenings coaching through a boundary dispute with his neighbor back in 2009, refusing every time he tried to pay me for it. Sal, of course, standing with his hand on my shoulder the way he used to stand over my desk when a file finally made sense. One by one, without anyone organizing it, without a word of speech or applause, a small crowd of people I had quietly helped over 3 decades simply gathered around me at the back of that hall, not saying much, just standing there, the way you stand near a fire on a cold night. Not because anyone asked them to, but because it was where they wanted to be. I did not know it yet, but the town had been keeping its own quiet account of me for 30 years, the same way I had kept theirs. Sophie found me in the middle of it, slipping between the legs of adults the way children do, and she looked up at the letter still in my hand, and up at Marcus, whose eyes were red and whose arm was around my shoulders in a way it hadn't been since he was a teenager. "Grandpa," she said, in the clear, unbothered voice of an 8-year-old who has just watched the adults around her come entirely undone and doesn't yet understand why it matters so much. Why does it matter whose name is on the paper if everybody still loves each other? Nobody answered her right away. Marcus made a sound that was half a laugh and half something else entirely, and knelt down in front of his daughter, and I watched my son find, in his own child's plain question, something that a month of lawyers and locksmiths and title searches had never once managed to hand him. "It matters," he said slowly, working it out as he said it, "because sometimes people forget how to show love the honest way, and they start trying to prove it with paper instead. Grandma's paper was never about keeping anybody out, Soph. It was about making sure nobody could ever take this family's home and use it against us. That's it. That's the whole reason." He looked up at me. "I forgot that people can love you and still tell you no, Dad. I spent so long thinking love meant getting what I wanted from you that I never noticed you were still saying yes to me every single day, just not with money." I did not have a wall left in me by that point. I sat down on the folding chair beside my son and my granddaughter, in the same hall where I'd first met Eleanor 39 years earlier, and I let myself cry in front of the whole town of Millbrook. For my wife, for the year I went quiet when Marcus was 14, for 11 years of a secret his mother carried alone to protect him, and for the son who was at last sitting beside me instead of standing across a driveway from me. We buried the deed, the old one, the decorative one from the fire safe, the one Marcus had spent years assuming would someday be his, in the garden that fall, beneath Eleanor's tomato plants, not as a gesture of spite, but because Marcus asked to do it himself, said he wanted the old lie to go back into the ground where something honest could grow over it instead. I let him. Some closures a father has to hand his son the shovel for, the locks are the same ones Anderson installed that terrible morning. I never changed them back. I decided, somewhere in the weeks after the memorial, that new locks weren't the enemy. What mattered was who held the keys, and today there are 3 sets. Mine, Marcus's, and a small one on Sophie's key ring that opens nothing but makes her feel, she told me, like she belongs to the house too. Marcus comes by most Sundays now, sometimes with Sophie, sometimes alone, and we sit at the kitchen table where his mother used to set a candle on Friday nights, and we don't always talk about anything important. Sometimes that's the whole point. The house is still held in trust, exactly as Eleanor arranged it 11 years ago, and it will pass, when my own time comes, to Sophie and whatever brothers or sisters life still has in mind for her. Held safe by a decision my wife made alone, in a lawyer's office, out of a love so careful and so quietly fierce that it took her death to finally let me see the whole shape of it. I think about that a great deal, these long Ohio evenings, sitting in the chair by the window where Eleanor used to read. A man spends his whole career learning to read the fine print of other people's lives, learning to trust nothing until the paper confirms it. It took losing the only woman who ever fully knew me to teach me that the truest deed I ever held was never the one locked in a fire safe. It was the one she'd been quietly filing, for 11 patient years, in the one place a husband never thinks to look, the soft, worn corners of a sewing box, waiting for the exact moment I would need it most. If there is a lesson in any of this, it isn't about locks or trusts, or the particular cruelty of a moving truck booked before a mother's casket is even in the ground. It's this: love that has to hide itself from half the family isn't protecting anyone. And love strong enough to bury a hard truth for 11 years, waiting patiently for the one moment it might finally do some good. That kind of love doesn't need a courtroom to prove itself. It just needs someone, eventually, brave enough to open the box.